So, has anyone ever thought what it would mean to fight across solar systems? What if Earth had to fight against Alpha Centauri? What would that mean? How would that work? Well, kind of the very first thing you would have to question is how are you going to get there? That's a very long distance to be sending warships because right now, as we have our abilities to do things, that is basically a lifetime trip for I think a couple of people. So obviously, if Earth's going to fight Alpha Centauri, you got to be able to have interstellar travel. So what would that mean? Well, depends on which universe you're in. So if you haven't been able to figure out, we're going to be going over the various ways that interstellar travel can affect warfare. Now, generally speaking, there are four major types of intergalactic travel or interstellar travel. And I'm going to start at the most realistic and go to what's basically space magic. This means in order we're going to go acceleration, warp, dimension hopping basically, and wormholes. So before we can go over the various types of interstellar travel and their effect on warfare, we need to have at least a baseline for what we're talking about. So we're going to briefly go over the various weapons that would be at your disposal within these situations. So first and foremost is the typical what you would call artillery or main batteries. If you're thinking about this in terms of a battleship, this is kind of the big guns and the medium guns, your ship-to-ship weapons. This in Star Wars, this would mean turbo lasers. Next up is going to be your smaller weapons, which is almost at your point defense level, but this would be so in Star Wars. This would be your laser cannons, and this is your anti-starfighter capabilities. It's not necessarily designed to take out a missile, but it is designed to take out a fighter. And then we have the point defenses, which is just even smaller than what would be a laser cannon in Star Wars. This is if you're looking at modern warfare. This is your CWIS. This is how you shoot missiles out of the sky, basically. Next up, you're going to have torpedoes, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of a dumb fire. You're aiming in a general direction. If it hits an enemy ship, it's typically going to do a lot of damage, if not destroy it. Now, torpedoes can be programmed, but effectively speaking, if you're talking torpedo, it doesn't have a precise lock-on usually. Next up is going to be missiles. These are things that will have lock-ons, and they're typically reserved for longer ranges. It's much more of that beyond line of sight that we have nowadays, where you're shooting something and it way the heck out there is when it finally hits. Or if you're doing starfighter to starfighter combat, it's a very maneuverable little missile. And since you're doing starfighter to starfighter, one hit will usually take down starfighters. Next up, you're going to have mines, and that is exactly what it sounds like. It is a mine of some sort. You put it down, and it either gravitates towards a ship or it blocks off an area and detonates if something gets near. Then we're going to have bombs, which again sound a lot like what it is. They're very dumbfire, but they are exclusively launched out of starfighters. So it's the closest you're going to get to gravity in space, which usually means a straight line, but depends on your franchise. And then we're going to also have starfighters in here because starfighters are often considered their own weapon. So if you have any small craft that's docked in and you would expel it out of the ship, that's what we're going to count here as well. And then finally, you end up with gimmick weapons. And I'm just going to tell you now, gimmick weapons depend on the gimmick. Some of them will work in some instances, some of them will work in others, and most of them have specific things. Like the Death Star is a gimmick weapon. If you know what a galaxy gun is, that's a gimmick weapon. They have specific requirements. If you're flinging asteroids at people, that's a gimmick weapon. So it is exclusively, entirely dependent upon the plot. So, with all that out of the way, let's start with the first method of interstellar travel, acceleration. So for acceleration, first and foremost, you need to understand that the enemy can see you coming a mile away. Just flat out, you're going lower than the speed of light, therefore they can see you coming. So what this means is that warfare will revolve around one of two things depending upon how the rest of your materials work, and that is either range or stealth. So for stealth, that's going to be the beginning and end of warfare. It is exclusively based around, can you see the enemy? So if you can see them and they can't see you, you're going to win the fight. If they can see you and you can't see them, they're going to win the fight. Most ships are going to be glass cannons. They're going to be massive weapons. Anything that can fly as a stealth ship will fly as a stealth ship. It'll be as glass cannon as possible because the entire thing is find the enemy first. Now, if it's range because your stealth capabilities have not exceeded your scanner capabilities and everybody can typically see people from a distance, then it's typically going to be range and point defenses. So this is how you're going to get a bunch of starfighters potentially, but also likely a large number of missiles and plenty of point defense on your capital ships. For the most part, you aren't usually going to see a lot of railguns here because railgun fire is actually less accurate at distance than missile fire, even though the missiles go slower. This is due to the side effect of no matter how fast your railgun is, it's still lower than the speed of light. So missiles being able to turn at the end of it will be more accurate. So you're going to get a lot of missile fire. Additionally, it's the same with starfighters. You can launch starfighters, they can go to the enemy fleet, and they can attack the enemy fleet and then come back. And that's it. And then your capital ships are going to have a lot of point defenses because it's missiles and fighters that are attacking them and not main guns. So that means for acceleration version of interstellar travel, you are stuck with either stealthy glass cannons or absolute turtles. And that's what you got. Now, moving on to number 2, which is warp. Scientifically speaking, warp is folding space in front of you and unfolding it behind you. So, what this ends up resulting in is a bubble where you have space folded in front, unfolded behind, and your ship's inside of that. If you want a better explanation, think of it as having to move 10 miles, but instead of walking 10 miles, you take all 10 miles, stack them on top of each other, walk 1 mile, and then unfold it all behind you. And that's what warp is. Now, obviously, in terms of warfare, this means that aiming at a ship in warp is nearly impossible because you're constantly folding and unfolding things, and that's going to make all manner of things wildly inaccurate. Anything kinetic, that's just pure kinetic, is usually going to miss, and missiles will get destroyed in that bubble. There are some technobabble ways to get around this, usually if you fly into the bubble or next to it, or if you have like a warp-capable missile or something like that, then you can fire into it. But typically speaking, this means that that bubble is a safe zone for everything but a mine. Now, to also mention, there is in almost all of these cases, you will see something along the lines of scanners where they can see you faster than the speed of light. So typically they can see you coming, but they can't hit you until you drop out of warp. So usually this will result in your ships having a main gun. They're going to have torpedoes because they're high damage and, a little dumbfire, some tracking, but not a whole lot. And anything that's got a lot of really rapid turning missiles, but not distance missiles. Just because a lot of these ships can get really maneuverable. Now, typically, I don't see a whole lot of fighters in relation to warp technology. I'm not 100% certain why this is. Narratively speaking, I don't see any real reason for it, other than, people don't want to deal with multiple little ships, but functionally, a lot of times what's said is that the fighters are too small to have their own warp drive, so you just get a bunch of bigger capital ships instead. So moving on to number 3, this is dimension hopping. This includes everything from the Star Wars hyperspace to Warhammer 40K's traveling through hell. Now, obviously, this means there's a couple of subcategories to this, so we're going to sort them out into kind of the 2 major ones, which is the dimension requires active maintenance, and it does not require active maintenance, and that's the difference between hyperspace and 40K. So in the instance of something that requires active maintenance, this is where if you damage a hyperdrive, then the ship falls out of hyperspace. If you are not actively trying to stay in this dimension, you are ripped out of it. And that has some very specific implications for fighting. Now, first and foremost, this means you cannot fight in hyperspace. Period. At least not ship-to-ship combat. Any boarding action works perfectly fine. But once in hyperspace, you're safe. Nobody can fight you in hyperspace because anything they shoot at you will immediately be ripped out of hyperspace and then left at the wayside. Now, what this has as a side effect is if you have things like hyperspace lanes, they can be mined to all hell to the point that you can't go there because there's just way too many mines. Now, I'm going to take a brief moment to address interdiction and point out that it doesn't have a major effect on the actual combat because interdiction is never used as a stable event that you can always interdict things. It's always kind of one of the more gimmick weapons that occurs. So it is never planned out that I've ever seen. So that it's a major force in whatever galaxy, even in Star Wars, where there are flat out interdictor Star Destroyers. Every interdictor Star Destroyer is rare and typically very underarmed and cannot affect a large area. So for the actual combat of this means that you're stuck with a lot of situations where range is completely useless because it doesn't matter if you can hit something 2 solar systems away when I can just drop my ship on your head and blow you from point blank range. So all carriers will have main cannons. Just if you don't have a main cannon on your carrier, it's about to get destroyed because it's got no way to defend itself from dropping a Star Destroyer on its head and just blowing it up right there. Most weapons will be line of sight. You'll end up with torpedoes, which have a lot of explosive compared to their propellant area. They don't have a whole lot of tracking capability, but it is going to be a lot of damage there. And you will also have fighters, depending upon how good your point defenses are. But usually, since you can strap a hyperdrive onto a fighter, or you can just drop out a carrier, disgorge all your fighters, and go back into hyperspace, then you're going to have a lot of fighter combat as well. That tends to result in this type of travel being the closest to World War II naval combat of all of the variations. And that's just because in World War II naval combat, nobody could. Once you found somebody, you could do it, but all combat was restricted to what's effectively knife fighting range when it comes to aerial combat. So there was no like over the horizon kind of shooting. Everybody had to get basically right up on them to shoot, and hyperspace, due to the sheer mobility you get on even large capital ships, restricts a lot of things from being even an attempt at range, because if you just make a ranged fleet, your enemy is just going to make a bunch of tanks, drop them inside of your battle line, and kill you. Now, to move on to the second subcategory, which is the passive version of dimension hopping, this ends up being a lot like our next one, which will be wormholes. But it has a side effect of being you're just moving in a different dimension, so you can fight in that other dimension. And in 40k, that's actually a flat out plot point because the demons will constantly attack you in the other dimension. But this works for anyone that is just passively in another dimension. You can fight, and if you're not noticed in the other dimension, you can pop out right away. But if someone notices you in the other dimension, they can go to that dimension and just, it's a normal combat engagement. This will have the result of meaning that most ships are built around your ability to see and hit targets at range. There will be some stealth capabilities as well, but for the most part, you're going to have a fleet where if they're in an area, they're going to drop down a permanent sensor in that second dimension, and it'll alert them if someone's coming. They'll just switch over to that dimension and attack you there. So there will be a lot of ranged combat occurring here, since you don't have the ability to just drop somebody on their head. You'll also have a lot of fighters, and you'll have people trying to outmaneuver things a lot. So this means that while ships will have some main guns, they're typically going to rely more on missiles and torpedoes, things that they can shoot at distance, as well as fighters. And they're going to shy away from mines, since you can typically come out of the other dimension at any location. So mining a place is usually going to be a futile effort. Now, in the inverse side of this, actually, for the passive dimension hopping, there's also going to likely be a lot of fortress locations, since because you have the ability to just come out anywhere, the ability to defend your supply chain is going to be extremely important, and the best way to do that is to effectively build a fortress around it. So, now moving on to number 4, this one has a bit of caveats on it, but it's much more of a range of situations, and this is the wormhole travel. Now, the operative condition for wormhole travel is how long does it take from opening the wormhole to you getting through it. Because In case you didn't notice, a wormhole is about the best choke point the enemy's going to get. They know where you're coming from, they know you're going to show up. So if you open a wormhole into an enemy fleet, they're just going to start shooting at that wormhole until it closes or a ship comes through it, at which point they'll switch to the ship. This means that your ship's combat capability is going to be directed based around how fast it can make it through that choke point. If, on a relative scale, it takes a long time to make it through your wormhole, you're not going to have very close range fights because you want to be in a situation where you can get completely out of the wormhole before you engage. Whereas if you can basically teleport, you're going to want to be able to teleport right in, and everything's going to be a knife fight again. So in the instance where it takes a while to get out, you're going to have a lot of point defenses. You'll have some fighter complement, but typically it's going to be big guns and missiles just to keep things way the heck out. You'll have ships that are built fairly tanky, and you're going to try your best to survive that initial salvo against you, since the attacker is always on the defensive here. Now, if your wormhole is basically a teleport, then you're going to have big ships with the ability to do a lot of damage in a short period of time, which means you're going to have a lot of torpedoes, a lot of big guns. You're not really going to have many fighters because those have to be, deployed first. And then you're going to have most of your guns and most of your weapons oriented into broadsides. And for anyone who doesn't know what a broadside is, that's just having all of your guns fire in one direction. And as you can imagine, that would be beneficial if you're just trying to immediately destroy ships before they even know you've arrived. Now, at the end of all this, I'd like to point out that in all of these settings, you can have ships that don't fit within this particular paradigm. However, these are rarely going to be the mainstays of any fleet. As for a good example of this, in Star Wars, you have the broadside cruiser and the Imperial torpedo sphere. Both of these ships are missile-based, with the broadside being concussion missiles and the torpedo sphere being proton torpedoes, obviously. The broadside's job is to sit at the back of a formation and just throw concussion missiles past the mainline warships. So there's rarely a ton of them, and they're quite vulnerable in any situation that isn't a fleet. The torpedo sphere's job is to crack planetary shields. You typically don't see this ship unless there's a siege going on, and its goal is to break the shields and then get the heck out, because mainline warships, starfighters, corvettes, everything can take out a torpedo sphere pretty easily. Well, everything short of a super star destroyer, which can't really dodge. So dreadnoughts are a little weak to it, but that's purely based on size. So overall, do understand that what I've given you is going to be the main fleets, which you're going to see the majority of the time, but that shouldn't preclude you from having other options. Just try not to make them the mainstays of a fleet. Make them be more gimmick ships. You can have one be a hero ship even, but just try to understand their general statement so that you know when to use them appropriately, and if you need to default, take this list as a good default, as a good way to build up basic fleets that you can modify from there. So, with that, I hope you all have a good night.